Hey everyone, welcome to Revenge Line today. I've got a story from Indianapolis, Indiana. I never imagined that setting strict boundaries with my toxic family would eventually lead to this incredibly satisfying moment. My name is Rose, and I am 32 years old. I stood firmly in the doorway and calmly asked if they had asked the homeowner for permission when I saw my parents and my younger sister standing at my door with their suitcases. My sister immediately frowned at me with a look of genuine confusion as she retorted that this was our parents' house, so she certainly did not need any permission to enter. I simply smiled at her delusional confidence and replied that she should dream on, sweetheart, because this property was never theirs to claim. The arrogant expression on her face vanished just 10 minutes later when they were forcibly escorted out of my yard while crying and begging to at least be allowed back inside to get their shoes. I watched them shivering in the snow without a shred of guilt because they had finally learned that my home was no longer their playground. Before we continue this story, I want to invite you to subscribe to the channel and like the video to support these stories. Please comment below your city and let me know if you would call the police on your own family. Now let's see how we got here. Living as a chief accountant in the bustling city of Indianapolis requires a level of professional discipline that has become second nature to me over the last decade. My four-bedroom house is not merely a significant financial asset, but a carefully constructed fortress of solitude that I built after escaping the suffocating atmosphere of my childhood home. I spent 10 years working double shifts and saving every single penny to ensure that I would never have to rely on anyone else for my survival or happiness. This sanctuary represents my freedom from the toxic dynamics that defined my upbringing, and I have always guarded my personal space with the same ferocity that I apply to auditing financial discrepancies at work. This carefully constructed peace was shattered 2 weeks ago on a Tuesday night when a violent storm was battering the city windows with relentless fury. The doorbell rang with an aggressive urgency that made me jump from my comfortable spot on the sofa where I was reviewing monthly reports. I approached the entrance with extreme caution because I was certainly not expecting any visitors at such a late hour during terrible weather. I unlocked the heavy deadbolt and swung the door open to reveal two huddled figures standing on my welcome mat against the biting wind. It took me a moment to recognize the soaked and shivering people standing before me as my father Larry and my mother Joyce. Their clothes were completely drenched from the downpour, and they looked more haggard and desperate than I had ever seen them in my entire life. Mom immediately lunged forward to wrap her cold, wet arms around me before I could even ask what they were doing on my porch in the middle of the night. She began sobbing uncontrollably into my shoulder, wailing about how a massive oak tree had crashed through the roof of their old countryside home during the gale. She cried loudly that the house was completely uninhabitable due to structural damage, and they had absolutely nowhere else to go while waiting for the slow insurance adjusters to process their claim. My instincts screamed that something was wrong because they rarely visited me without demanding money, and the story sounded slightly rehearsed. However, seeing Dad standing there shaking violently from the cold with his head bowed low silenced my immediate doubts. I stepped aside to let them enter the warmth of the foyer because leaving them outside would have been cruel, regardless of our strained history. The professional accountant in me refused to let sudden emotions override logic, even in the midst of a family crisis. I went into my home office to grab a notepad and a pen while they dried themselves off with the fresh towels I provided from the linen closet. I sat down at the kitchen island and wrote a simple but binding handwritten document titled Short-Term Guest Agreement, which clearly stated they could stay for exactly 14 days. I wanted to make sure there was no confusion about the timeline because I knew how easily a few days could turn into a few months with them. I returned to the living room and placed the paper on the coffee table in front of them with a firm expression that brokered no argument. Dad looked at the document with a mixture of disbelief and deep offense as he read the strict terms regarding their mandatory departure date. He frowned deeply, his face twisting in annoyance, and muttered under his breath about how ungrateful it was for a daughter to calculate days with her own parents like a cold-hearted landlord. I ignored his passive-aggressive comment and simply tapped the paper where he needed to sign, because this was the only condition under which I would allow them to stay. He scribbled his signature on the bottom of the page with obvious frustration, because he realized that his manipulative guilt trips would not work on me tonight. I took the signed agreement and locked it securely inside my fireproof safe, telling myself that I was just offering temporary shelter to family members in need. I had absolutely no idea that I had just officially invited dangerous invaders into my sanctuary, who had no intention of ever leaving. 3 days after they moved in, the peace in my house had completely disappeared, as if it had never existed in the first place. I returned home from a long day at the firm to find my once pristine and organized kitchen transformed into a chaotic and greasy nightmare that made my stomach turn. Mom Joyce had decided to unilaterally reorganize my entire culinary workspace without asking for a single opinion from the actual homeowner. I opened my pantry door to find that my curated collection of imported truffle salts and expensive organic saffron had been unceremoniously thrown into the trash bin like worthless garbage. She had replaced my high-quality ingredients with bulk containers of generic sodium and cheap spices that left a lingering odor of stale grease hanging heavy in the air throughout the entire first floor. I stood there clutching my briefcase while trying to control the rising panic in my chest, because my sanctuary was being dismantled piece by piece by someone who was supposed to be a guest. The situation only worsened later that evening when we sat down to eat the heavy and oily meal she had prepared without my consent. Dad did not seem the least bit grateful for the shelter or food I was providing, but instead appeared incredibly interested in the financial value of my assets. He looked around the dining room with calculating eyes before leaning in to ask me invasive questions about my current financial standing. "Is the accountant's salary good these days, daughter? This house must be worth $500,000 if sold right." His voice held a greedy undertone that made me lose my appetite immediately, because he sounded less like a father and more like an investor assessing a property. I deflected his questions with vague answers about the fluctuating real estate market, because I knew better than to reveal my true net worth to him. My intuition screamed that something was terribly wrong with their story about the storm damage, because their behavior did not match that of people who had just lost their home to a natural disaster. I decided to take action the next morning by calling my best friend Sarah, who works as a senior mortgage specialist at the local bank, to ask for a favor. We met at a quiet coffee shop downtown where I hoped to get some clarity on the situation regarding my parents' property in the countryside. Sarah slid a thick manila folder across the small wooden table with a look of pure sympathy on her face that made my heart sink. She took a deep breath before delivering the news that would shatter whatever fragile trust I had left for my parents. "Rose, there was no storm. Your parents' house was foreclosed by the bank last month because of gambling debts." I felt the blood drain from my face as I stared at the foreclosure documents that proved their entire story was a complete fabrication. They were not displaced victims of a natural disaster as they had claimed, but were actually homeless manipulators who had gambled away their own roof. I realized with a sickening jolt that they had not come to my house for a temporary stay while repairs were being made. They were here because they had absolutely nowhere else to go and were looking for a new host to parasitize indefinitely. I drove home in a daze while realizing that I was dealing with professional liars who would say anything to maintain their comfort at my expense. I knew I could not confront them yet without concrete proof of their future intentions, because they would simply lie and gaslight me until I doubted my own sanity. I stopped at an electronics store to purchase high-definition hidden cameras with audio recording capabilities to monitor their conversations when I was away. I spent the afternoon installing them discreetly behind the air vents and on top of the bookshelves while they were out taking a walk around the neighborhood. That very night, I sat in my locked bedroom with my headphones on as I watched the live feed from the living room on my laptop screen. Mom was pacing back and forth while holding her phone to her ear with a conspiratorial grin on her face that chilled me to the bone. I turned up the volume to hear her whispering to someone on the other end of the line with a tone of mockery. "Don't worry, your sister is stupid. Just get your things ready, you can come over soon." Her words cut through me like a knife because I knew exactly who she was talking to and what they were planning. They were not just crashing for 2 weeks. They were preparing to move the rest of the clan in to take over my life completely. 1 week passed, and the atmosphere in the house became tense and stifling, like a string about to snap under the immense pressure of their unspoken demands. My parents had launched a calculated psychological campaign designed to erode my boundaries and make me feel guilty for my success. They spent every waking moment making subtle comments about how much better other children treated their aging parents compared to my cold professionalism. They would loudly praise the neighbor's son who built an in-law suite for his mother while looking directly at me with disdainful eyes. It was a classic manipulation tactic known as gaslighting, which they had perfected during my childhood, to make me feel inadequate and selfish for having basic needs. I found myself walking on eggshells in my own home because every conversation was a trap intended to force me into submission. We were sitting in the living room on a Thursday evening attempting to watch a movie when my mother decided to escalate their plan to the next level. Joyce let out a long and dramatic sigh that was loud enough to drown out the television dialogue before shaking her head with exaggerated sorrow. She looked around the spacious living room with a performative sadness and wiped a non-existent tear from her cheek to ensure she had my full attention. Her voice trembled with fake emotion as she delivered the line she had likely rehearsed in front of the mirror earlier that day. "Poor Alice is suffering so much in that cramped rental apartment while her own sister lives in such luxury." Larry immediately seized the opportunity to join the attack by slamming his hand down on the coffee table with enough force to make the coasters jump. He stared at me with an intensity that was meant to be intimidating as he delivered his lecture on familial duty. He leaned forward aggressively to invade my personal space and make me feel small in my own house. "You should bring your sister over here immediately because sisters must support each other instead of wasting all this space." My natural instinct was to scream that Alice was a grown woman who refused to hold a steady job and that my house was not a commune for lazy relatives. However, I remembered the recording devices hidden in the vents and the grand finale I was meticulously planning for next week. I knew that fighting back now would only make them more defensive and harder to corner when the deadline arrived. I softened my posture to look defeated and lowered my eyes to the floor to simulate submission to their authority. I took a deep breath to steady my voice before delivering the lie that would seal their fate. "I have been feeling quite lonely lately, so it might be nice to have some company in the house." The transformation in their demeanor was instantaneous and terrifying to witness because it confirmed their predatory nature without a doubt. They exchanged a look of triumphant smugness that screamed they believed they had finally broken my will after years of trying. They likely thought that the successful and independent accountant had finally crumbled under the pressure of their parental authority. Mom immediately stopped her fake crying and began texting furiously on her phone, which I assumed was her signaling Alice to pack her bags. They were so blinded by their perceived victory that they did not notice the cold calculation hiding behind my lowered lashes. I excused myself to go to the bathroom where I pulled out my phone to check the live feed from the living room camera. I watched them high-five each other like two con artists who had just pulled off the heist of the century against an unsuspecting victim. I stared at their celebrating pixelated faces on my screen with a cold detachment that surprised even me. They were laughing at my expense in the home I worked 10 years to build while plotting to bring the third parasite into my sanctuary. I sat on the edge of the bathtub and began making the necessary arrangements that would legally remove this tumor from my life permanently. I sent a confirmation email to a reputable locksmith service to schedule a full perimeter rekeying for exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon on the 14th day. I also contacted a junk removal service instead of a moving company because I had no intention of treating their belongings with care. Everything was set in motion for the deadline written in the guest agreement they had so foolishly signed without reading closely. I whispered to the empty room that they could keep laughing for now because they were digging their own graves. On the morning of the 14th day, just as the miserable script I had predicted was about to unfold, the final act of their invasion began with the screeching of tires against the pavement. I was standing by the living room window drinking my coffee when a yellow taxi pulled up aggressively onto my driveway and parked diagonally, as if the driver owned the place. My younger sister Alice stepped out of the vehicle with the arrogance of a visiting dignitary who expects a red carpet welcome instead of a family member asking for help. The driver struggled to unload 3 massive suitcases from the trunk, which clearly indicated that she had absolutely no intention of leaving anytime soon. She stood there adjusting her sunglasses and looking at my house with a critical eye before gesturing impatiently for our father to come out and help her with the bags. Alice completely ignored my presence standing in the doorway, as if I were nothing more than the hired help waiting to take her coat. She breezed past me without a single word of greeting and launched herself into the waiting arms of our parents who were beaming with pride at her arrival. I watched with a cold detachment as she hugged them theatrically before marching straight past the living room and heading directly for the staircase. I followed them up the stairs silently to see exactly how far they were willing to push their boundaries on this final day. Alice walked straight into the master bedroom, which was my personal sanctuary, and spun around with a greedy delight in her eyes. She pointed a manicured finger at my bed and declared loud enough for the neighbors to hear that she wanted this room because it had the best view of the lake. The audacity of her demand made my blood boil beneath the surface, but I kept my face perfectly neutral as I watched my mother nod in agreement. Joyce looked at me with a challenging expression as if daring me to refuse her precious daughter the comfort she apparently deserved more than the person paying the mortgage. I turned around and walked back downstairs because I knew that arguing now would only alert them to the trap I was about to spring. We gathered in the dining room for lunch shortly after Alice had dumped her heavy luggage in the middle of the hallway to block everyone's path. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of their victory because they truly believed they had successfully conquered my territory without firing a single shot. My father decided that this was the perfect moment to officially reveal the plan that I had already uncovered days ago through my surveillance cameras. He cleared his throat loudly to command the attention of the table and looked at me with a smug expression that made my stomach churn. He announced with absolute conviction that from this day forward the entire family would be living here together under one roof. He explained without a hint of shame that they had already sold all their furniture and belongings back in the countryside because we were a family unit. He finished his speech by stating that the money I earned was actually family money, which meant that what belonged to me now belonged to everyone at this table. I felt a wave of pure rage threatening to explode out of my chest, but I forced it down into the pit of my stomach where it burned like acid. I clenched my hands into fists under the table until my knuckles turned white, while plastering a fake smile onto my face that felt like a mask. I looked at each of them in turn and forced my voice to sound cheerful and submissive as I agreed with their delusional plan. I told them that it was actually a great idea, and that having everyone together would make the house feel much more alive than it had in years. I suggested that to celebrate this momentous family reunion properly, they should all go out to dinner tonight at the most expensive 5-star steakhouse in downtown Indianapolis. Alice's eyes lit up with excitement the moment I mentioned the restaurant because she was obsessed with posting photos of expensive meals on her social media accounts to impress her friends. She immediately turned to our parents and began urging them to get ready because she had not eaten a proper lobster dinner in months. I walked over to my purse and pulled out a supplementary credit card that I had specifically prepared for this exact moment. I handed the card to my father with a trembling hand that he mistook for emotion, but was actually suppressed adrenaline. I told them that dinner was my treat to welcome everyone home, but I would not be joining them because I had a terrible migraine coming on. I explained that I needed to stay home and rest in the dark, so I would be fresh for our new life together starting tomorrow morning. They did not even pretend to be disappointed that I was not coming, because my absence meant they could order whatever they wanted without my judgment. I watched them rush upstairs to change into their best clothes, while I stood in the kitchen clutching the counter for support. I had set a spending limit on that card that would decline immediately after the appetizers were ordered, but they would not discover that until they were seated miles away. The trap was set, and the bait had been taken by three greedy fish who had no idea the water was about to be drained. That afternoon, as soon as their car disappeared behind the old oak trees at the end of the street, the pained expression of a migraine sufferer vanished from my face instantly to be replaced by cold determination. I walked calmly to the living room window to ensure they were truly gone before pulling my phone from my pocket to dial the number I had saved days ago. The team of professionals I had hired was already parked around the corner in an unmarked van, waiting for my signal to begin the reclamation of my property. I unlocked the front door and watched as three burly men from the junk removal service marched into my hallway with heavy boots and large rolls of industrial-strength black trash bags. I pointed upstairs to the guest rooms and the master bedroom, where my sister had just dumped her luggage with absolute entitlement, and instructed them to clear every single item that did not belong to me. The cleaning crew went to work with a ruthless efficiency that was deeply satisfying to watch as they swept clothes, toiletries, and personal effects into the bags as if they were clearing debris from a demolition site. They moved through the house like a whirlwind of justice, stripping the bed sheets my parents had slept on and emptying the bathroom drawers where Alice had spread out her cosmetics. One of the workers paused while holding a bottle of my mother's expensive perfume and a stack of Alice's makeup palettes to ask if I wanted to separate the fragile items to prevent breakage during the removal process. I looked at the pile of belongings that represented the people who had tried to steal my life and felt absolutely no sympathy for their material possessions. I looked him dead in the eye and coldly replied that there was no need to separate anything because he should just treat it all like recyclable trash. He nodded once without asking any further questions and tossed the items into the bottom of the bag with a loud crash that sounded like justice to my ears before continuing his work. The crew hauled the bulging black sacks out the front door and dragged them across the snowy lawn to the edge of the property line, without a shred of gentleness. They piled the bags unceremoniously on the icy sidewalk outside the iron fence, which technically classified as public land, to ensure I could not be sued for destroying their property inside the house. The mountain of luggage and trash bags sat there looking pathetic against the stark white snow, while the wind began to howl around them, serving as a visual representation of their new status in my life. While the movers were finishing their task of purging the house, the licensed locksmith I had hired was already working rapidly on the front and back doors to replace the tumblers. He installed high-security, heavy-duty deadbolts that were resistant to picking and bumping to ensure that no old key would ever turn in my house again. He also reset the digital keypad for the garage door and disconnected the remote openers that my father had likely clipped to the visor of his car to prevent any unauthorized electronic entry. Within 45 minutes, my vulnerable home had been transformed into an impenetrable fortress that was legally and physically sealed against the invaders who were currently enjoying a lobster dinner on my credit card. I paid the workers in cash and tipped them generously for their speed before locking the new deadbolt firmly behind them and listening to the satisfying click of the metal sliding into place. I took the original copy of the short-term guest agreement from my safe and taped it securely to the inside of the glass storm door at eye level, so it would be the first thing they saw. The expiration date was highlighted in bright yellow marker to ensure they could not miss the fact that their time was legally up and their presence was no longer welcome. I walked into the kitchen to brew a fresh pot of strong coffee because I knew I would need the caffeine to stay sharp for the confrontation that was inevitably coming. The aroma of roasted beans filled the clean air of the kitchen, which no longer smelled of my mother's greasy cooking or my father's cheap cologne. I turned off every single light in the house to create the illusion that I was asleep or absent and carried my steaming mug into the living room. I sat down on the plush sofa in the darkness and took a slow sip of the bitter coffee while keeping my eyes glued to the large front window. The streetlights flickered on as the winter evening deepened into night and illuminated the stage where the final act of this tragedy would play out. I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me as I waited patiently for the headlights to sweep across the driveway, because I knew that for the first time in my life, I held all the power. 2 hours later, the high-beam headlights of their taxi swept across the living room window like a searchlight, signaling that the hour of judgment had finally arrived for the people who thought they owned my life. I watched from the darkness of my living room as the vehicle came to a stop at the curb, and the three of them tumbled out of the back seat while laughing loudly about the expensive wine they had consumed at my expense. They were completely oblivious to the freezing temperature or the altered state of the property, because they were still drunk on the illusion of their victory and the comfort of the expensive meal I had unknowingly paid for. My sister Alice was the first to approach the gate, strutting with the confidence of a homeowner, until her high-heeled boot caught on something large and soft on the ground. She stumbled forward clumsily and let out a sharp cry of annoyance before looking down to see what had obstructed her path on the snowy walkway. Alice kicked at the large black mound in frustration until the plastic tore open to reveal the sleeve of her favorite designer coat, spilling out onto the wet slush. The realization hit her like a physical blow, and her scream of horror pierced the silent night air as she frantically began tearing at the other bags to find her entire wardrobe stuffed inside like common garbage. My father Larry immediately rushed past her to the front door, with a look of confusion etched on his face, fumbling in his pocket for the house key he had claimed as his own earlier that day. He jammed the metal key into the lock and twisted it violently, but the mechanism refused to budge because the internal tumblers had been completely replaced hours ago. Panic began to set in as he moved to the garage keypad and punched in the code repeatedly, only to be met with a flashing red light and a harsh error tone that denied him access to the sanctuary he thought he had conquered. The realization that they were locked out of the house with all their worldly possessions sitting in the snow triggered a primal rage in my mother Joyce that was terrifying to witness. She ran to the living room window where she could see my silhouette sitting calmly in the dark and began pounding on the glass with her fists. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure hatred that bore no resemblance to the weeping woman who had begged for shelter just 2 weeks ago. She pressed her face against the cold pane and screamed at the top of her lungs so loud that I could hear her clearly through the insulated glass. "Rose, open this door right now. What do you think you are doing, you ungrateful little brat?" I slowly stood up from the sofa and walked toward the front door, pausing only to flip the switch that controlled the bright LED floodlights on the front porch. The sudden illumination blinded them for a second, casting them in a harsh spotlight that revealed every line of desperation and fury on their faces. I stepped out onto the small foyer but remained safely behind the locked glass storm door, holding my steaming cup of coffee with both hands to warm my fingers. I looked at them with a detached curiosity, as if I were observing strangers having a breakdown on my lawn, feeling absolutely no emotional connection to their distress. Alice rushed up the porch steps and slammed her open palms against the glass door, her eyes wild with a mixture of entitlement and disbelief. She looked at the warmth radiating from inside the house, and then back at her ruined clothes in the snow, unable to comprehend that her reign of terror had ended so abruptly. She shouted at me through the glass with a voice that cracked from the cold and the sheer audacity of her demands. What right do you have to lock us out? This is our home too. Open this door immediately. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee while maintaining direct eye contact with her, letting the silence stretch out until they stopped screaming to hear my response. I lowered the mug slightly and spoke with a voice that was as cold and unyielding as the winter wind swirling around them. The 14-day agreement has expired. You are now officially intruders on my private property. Before they could launch another volley of insults or attempt to break the glass, the wailing sound of sirens cut through the night, rapidly growing louder as the patrol cars turned onto our street. I had called the police exactly 10 minutes ago to report an active trespassing situation involving aggressive individuals who refused to leave my property. Two police cruisers screeched to a halt in front of the driveway, their red and blue lights flashing rhythmically to illuminate the chaotic scene and the neighbors who had gathered on their porches to watch. My father immediately straightened his posture and walked toward the approaching officers with his hands raised, attempting to salvage his dignity and authority. He put on his best innocent face and tried to explain the situation to the stern-looking officer who stepped out of the vehicle. "Officer, thank goodness you are here. This is all a terrible misunderstanding. This is my daughter's house, and she is having some sort of mental breakdown and locked us out." The officer did not seem impressed by my father's performance and simply shined his flashlight past him to the front door, where I was pointing a steady finger. The beam of light landed squarely on the bright yellow highlighted document taped to the glass, clearly showing the signatures and the expiration date of their stay. The officer walked up the steps, read the guest agreement and the no trespassing notice, and then turned back to my father with a hardened expression. He stated clearly that the homeowner had provided proof of limited residency, and that their refusal to leave constituted criminal trespassing and disorderly conduct. My mother tried to lunge toward the door again, screaming that she gave birth to me and owned everything I had, but the officers had lost all patience with their aggressive behavior. I watched through the glass as the police grabbed their arms and forced them against the hood of the patrol car to apply handcuffs, while the neighbors watched in stunned silence. The image of Alice crying and begging to be let back in to get her shoes while being led away in cuffs was the final closure I needed to end this chapter of my life. 1 month has passed since that fateful night when the police lights faded from my driveway and true silence has finally returned to my life in Indianapolis. The chaotic energy that my family brought into my sanctuary has completely dissipated to be replaced by the steady rhythm of a peaceful existence that I have worked so hard to achieve. My lawyer, Mr. Henderson, called me yesterday morning to deliver the news that officially closed the legal chapter of this unfortunate saga. He informed me with a professional satisfaction that the court had fully granted the permanent restraining order against all 3 of my family members due to their aggressive behavior. The legal document explicitly states that they are prohibited from coming within 100 meters of me or my property under threat of immediate imprisonment. Hearing those words gave me a sense of security that I had not felt in years because I finally had the full force of the law standing between me and their toxicity. I have also received some interesting updates regarding their current living situations through the small-town gossip network that inevitably reached my ears. My younger sister Alice has suffered the most dramatic fall from grace because her lifestyle was entirely dependent on the generosity of others. She is currently working as a dishwasher at a greasy fast food establishment on the outskirts of the city to make ends meet. The image of her manicured hands scrubbing dirty trays instead of holding champagne glasses is a stark contrast to the entitled princess who demanded my master bedroom. My parents, Larry and Joyce, fared no better as they were forced to move into a cramped, subsidized apartment in a rough neighborhood because they had burned every other bridge. They apparently spend their days blaming each other for the loss of my house instead of reflecting on the greed that led them to this pathetic state. I decided that the only way to truly move forward was to purge my home of every lingering trace of their presence. I spent the entire last week engaged in a deep cleaning ritual that felt more like an exorcism of bad memories than simple housekeeping. I hired a team to repaint the kitchen walls to cover the grease stains my mother had left behind and replace the appliances she had used. I donated the mattress from the guest room where my father slept because I did not want to keep anything that had absorbed their negative energy. I even bought entirely new furniture for the living room to ensure that when I looked around my space, I saw only things that brought me joy. The house no longer smells of cheap cologne or desperation, but instead carries the fresh scent of lavender and the crisp winter air of freedom. I am currently sitting in my favorite armchair beside the crackling fireplace with a glass of wine in my hand while watching the snow fall gently outside the window. There was a time when I would have felt guilty for treating my own flesh and blood with such harshness, but that version of Rose no longer exists. I realized as I watched the flames dance that the ruthless decision I made that day was actually the greatest act of self-love I have ever performed. I chose to protect my mental health and my financial future over the archaic obligation to support people who only saw me as a resource to be exploited. The most important lesson I learned is that sharing DNA with someone does not give them a free pass to abuse your kindness or disrespect your home. We are often taught that family comes first, but that philosophy becomes dangerous when it requires you to set yourself on fire to keep others warm. True family is built on mutual respect and love, not on manipulation and entitlement, and it is perfectly acceptable to cut ties with toxic relatives. Another crucial realization is that establishing firm boundaries is an act of self-respect rather than an act of selfishness or cruelty. When you draw a line in the sand, you are teaching people how to treat you, and those who get angry at your boundaries are the ones who benefited from you having none. Protecting your peace is a necessity for survival, and you should never apologize for locking the door against chaos. Finally, you must never hand over the keys to your life, whether literal or metaphorical, to anyone who has not earned your absolute trust. Financial independence is the ultimate shield against manipulation and safeguarding. Your assets is the only way to ensure you never become a victim of someone else's failure. Thank you so much for listening to Rose's story and accompanying me on this journey from victimization to absolute victory. If you are currently dealing with toxic family members or struggling to set boundaries, I hope my story gives you the courage to stand up and protect your own sanctuary. Please remember to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below, sharing your thoughts on how you would have handled this situation.